Hi, and welcome to the first and last installment of Draw My Brain with Marion. Today's episode is going through Zarate's review of the neural control of singing. Now, why would we pick singing? What's so cool about the human voice as a musical instrument? For one thing, it's contained in the body. There's no external equipment necessary to make sweet tunes. Another thing, humans generally all have one. The adult vocal apparatus is already trained for both singing and speech. We all use our pipes for tunes, whether it be Happy Birthday, the national anthem, or just rocking out in the shower. We also use our vocal apparatus to color our speech, using differences in pitch and intonation to convey the intent of the sentence, the emotions behind it, and in tonal languages, the full meaning of the words. The everyday person has some pretty good vocal control, but singers have even better vocal control. Therefore, conducting studies using singing tasks can help determine not only what brain networks are engaged while singing, but also how vocal training influences different activation patterns. The only struggle is, the mechanisms of the voice are very convoluted. They need multiple networks in order to produce the desired end results. The paper that I used for this video, a review by Zarate in 2013, proposes that there are three main networks that work together to make the vocal apparatus do what it does best: the main vocal motor control system, the somatosensory feedback, and auditory feedback. But first, let's establish how the vocal tract works on a physical level. Air flows through the glottis, and intrinsic and extrinsic laryngeal muscles cause the vocal folds to change their length and stiffness. That determines the fundamental frequency, which is the pitch of the output. The power behind the sound comes from the diaphragm and the abs, which provide airflow and help regulate out the output intensity. The shape of the sound is determined by the articulatory muscles in the lip, tongue, and jaw. These muscles contain somatosensory receptors that configure the vocal tract into different ways that determine the formant frequency. That frequency contributes to the vowels and overall timbre. The vocal motor control system is very sensitive to auditory feedback and responds very quickly to a change in auditory stimulus. For example, a small decrease in perceived amplitude, aka loudness, elicits a proportional increase in vocal output amplitude. A similar thing happens with compensation in formant shifts and pitch shift. Pitch shift is the most pertinent aspect of feedback correction. When a subject vocalizes and the pitch of the auditory feedback is shifted up or down, the subject readily adjusts their pitch in the opposite direction of the shift to compensate. Pitch shift has two components: early pitch shift response and late pitch shift response. The early pitch shift response is usually about 25 to 50 cents, irrespective of the initial pitch shift magnitude. This occurs about 100 to 150 milliseconds after the initial pitch shift. The late pitch shift response can be adjusted manually in both magnitude and direction, if the subjects are given directions. This occurs about 250 to 600 milliseconds after the initial pitch shift. Now that we know more about how the vocal tract works in relation to other body parts and external stimuli, let's get down to how the brain works during the whole shebang. Now, as previously stated, there are three main neural networks in Zarate's model: the main vocal motor control system, the somatosensory feedback system, and the auditory feedback system. The motor control system starts with the making of complete vocal patterns from reticular formations and phonatory motor neurons. These receive input from the anterior cingulate cortex and the periaqueductal gray, in addition to the primary motor cortex and two subcortical loops, including the putamen, globulus pallidus, pontine gray, and the cerebellum. The anterior cingulate cortex and the periaqueductal gray initiate and emotionally motivate vocal responses, while the primary motor cortex is where the highest order of vocal control happens. It is from the primary motor cortex that we draw our learned vocalizations for speech and song. The functional organization of the vocal motor control may appear to be hierarchical, but it is also parallel, considering that damage to the second or third level exclusively will not inhibit all vocalizations. The next pathway is the somatosensory pathway, which is a more specific term for the vague sense of touch. Somatosensory receptors give feedback about how the vocal system is doing through the glossopharyngeal nerve, the vagus nerve, and the thalamus. These pathways go to the primary and secondary somatosensory cortex, S1 and S2 respectively, with the thalamus also giving some information to the insula. The ventral portion of S1, which is adjacent to the part of the primary motor cortex that handles articulations, processes somatosensory information concerning articulatory movements. The anterior portion of the insula is recruited during overt vocalization such as speech or song. The third pathway is the auditory feedback pathway. Auditory processing of pitch starts in the organ of Corti, transducing vibrations on the basilar membrane of the cochlea. Pitch receivers are transmitted and processed along the ascending auditory pathway, which includes the cochlear nucleus, the lateral lemniscus, the inferior colliculus, and the medial geniculate nucleus of the thalamus. Pitch information, along with other auditory information, are processed in the primary and secondary auditory cortices found in Heschel's gyrus. Within Heschel's gyrus, located laterally is a potentially pitch-specific processing area. However, changes in pitch activates areas outside of the Heschel's gyrus, including the right superior temporal gyrus, the planum temporale, and the planum temporale. Timbre, on the other hand, is processed along the superior temporal sulcus. Voices, like faces, are easily recognized and cataloged by the human brain. There are three distinct regions for voice recognition. The anterior STS is associated with familiar voice recognition. The mid to anterior STS is thought to be where the spectral characteristics of voices are processed, and the posterior STS is involved with the recognition of unfamiliar voices. The latter is thought to be involved with the processing of spectrotemporal details in general. Now the real question is, how do all these regions interact with each other so as to provide cohesive feedback to the vocal apparatus? The anterior cingulate cortex and the periaqueductal gray both receive somatosensory and auditory input. The PAG may control involuntary auditory vocal reflexes, such as the Lombard reflex or formant and pitch shift responses, without additional control from the cortical regions. The insula acts as a gateway for somatosensory and auditory information to the anterior cingulate cortex. The anterior insula is associated with the integration of different modalities, such as auditory, visual, motor, etc. It is engaged specifically during voiced speech or song. So that's how the neural network of the vocal system is supposed to work. This is the general layout for every human with a functioning vocal apparatus. But what happens to this system when someone trains to become a competent, if not professional, singer? We know that in general, singers are pretty excellent at auditory and motor tasks. They are better at pitch, timbre, and voice discrimination than the general public. Studies involving mask auditory feedback have implied that singers rely more on somatosensory feedback than on auditory feedback to ensure their production quality. The amount of vocal training correlates positively with the amount of activity in S1 and the somatosensory association cortex. To test how much singers relied on somatosensory feedback, Fleber et al. In 2013 applied a topical anesthetic to the vocal folds of singers and non-musicians prior to singing in an fMRI scanner to reduce somatosensory feedback. With the anesthesia, the singers displayed reduced activity in the right anterior insula and a decreased functional connectivity to M1, S1, and the auditory cortex, while the non-musicians showed increased activity and enhanced functional connectivity respectively. However, the singers still sang more accurately than the non-musicians. This means that even though singers rely more heavily on somatosensory feedback in general, singers can effectively ignore somatosensory feedback by regulating activity in the right anterior insula if they deem the feedback to be inhibitive of good performance. In another study by Zatare et al. In 2008, they used pitch-shifted auditory feedback in an fMRI that targeted brain regions involved in auditory vocal motor control in singing. They asked singers and non-musicians alike to A, ignore the pitch shift and maintain the current pitch, and to B, compensate by adjusting their pitch to correct for the pitch shift. Both groups engaged the interparietal sulcus and the dorsal premotor cortex in each task. Non-musicians showed more activity in the DPMC, while singers instead showed more activity in the auditory cortical regions of the PSTS, anterior insula, and the ACC. The intraparietal sulcus, known as the IPS, is usually associated with the transformation of sensory input for motor preparation. But in this instance, Zarate proposes that it is being recruited to transform auditory input into frequency spatial information. This could be used by the DPMC to prepare a vocal response. In singers, there was enhanced functional activity between the PSCS and the IPS. The auditory cortex and the IPS jointly process pitch shifts. Since the auditory cortex is functionally connected to the insula and thus the ACC, the information may be sent to the anterior insula and thus to the ACC to properly do the deed. So, now that we've gone a little into the difference between non-musicians and long-time singers, let's talk about the in-between, how short-term training affects vocal skills and their neural underpinnings. Pitch discrimination is a musical skill that is ideal for testing this, as it has been proven to be effective in a short range of training and is often accompanied by neuroplasticity. Because pitch discrimination could enhance the ability to detect slight errors in vocal accuracy, it is hypothesized that training in pitch discrimination could enhance the vocal accuracy of the subject. Zarate put this hypothesis to the test by taking two groups of non-musicians, training one group in auditory discrimination and leaving the other group as the control. After testing both groups on auditory discrimination and singing tasks, they came up with mixed results. Although the experimental group displayed better auditory discrimination and training-induced changes in auditory task-associated neural activity, they did not show significant improvements in performance, nor did they recruit the experience-dependent network for auditory motor control in singing. Therefore, auditory training alone is not sufficient for improving vocal accuracy, nor for recruiting the experience-dependent network. It takes years of training in both auditory and vocal skills to achieve not only the desired brain activity, but that juicy sound. So that's that. If you're interested in knowing more of the neural underpinnings of singing, or the studies reviewed in detail, check out Zarate's review of the neural control of singing on which this video was based. Thanks for watching.